Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, with Mildred, who hasn't been around for a while. So I thought maybe she should put in an appearance. She doesn't like to get picked up that much, but she's calmed down a lot since her kittenhood. She really has. As you can see, she's really become quite the lady. So I'm going to put her on this thing behind me, and she will probably jump down immediately. Here you go. That's a good girl. Good girl. Okay. Well, just so you know, some of you have asked where she is. That's where she is. She's the horizontal cat. You know, Finster is vertical. She's always jumping up and she hangs out and that stuff, so you get to see her a lot. Mildred stays more or less at ground level and isn't prone to appearing when I do these videos unless she wants to play. She'll scratch me and sit sort of down below. So that's Mildred. What are we talking about? Oh, I know. The 5 least deserving conductors supported by major record labels. This is actually an interesting topic. It will be followed, not to fear, by the 5 most deserving conductors supported by major record labels. So don't jump the gun and try and guess who they'll be. We're just going to do one at a time. The least deserving conductors, it's an education on the power of the recorded music industry to make or break careers and to create careers for all kinds of reasons. There were always conductors who got jobs because the record labels wanted them to have jobs. And it was important back in the day, in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, you know, when making records formed an enormous business, a money-making business for major orchestras and the musicians who played in them. Erich Leinsdorf is a fabulous example of somebody who got the job in Boston in the 60s because RCA wanted him to. They were making opera recordings in Italy with him, and they thought that he would be a good fit for their label and to record all the standard German repertoire that Charles Munch had not done. And so they got Leinsdorf. It turned out to be a terrible decision. And not that Leinsdorf was terrible, mind you, but he was mediocre at most things. And he made lots and lots and lots of records. I don't know if you remember them. They had, Boston Symphony was called the aristocrat of orchestras. They had this whole branding thing going with Erich Leinsdorf. So since then, were quite a few conductors, I believe, who were essentially media creations. Not that they were terrible, not that they didn't make the occasional wonderful record, but they made lots of records. And their reputation was, to a large extent, the creation of the media empire that these record labels ran, because in those days, orchestras themselves did not have huge PR machines. Now they do. And now they do their own PR. They can drink their own Kool-Aid, as they often do, whenever they have a new music director who sucks and they have to pretend he's the greatest thing since sliced bread. So, yeah, here is my list with the explanations of why people are on my list. And you, of course, can come up with your own. First, Georg Solti. Now, Solti was a good opera conductor. He was a good theatrical conductor. He was sort of brutal and, unsubtle and exciting in a dramatic sort of way. As a symphonic conductor, he was much, much more patchy. But he, like so many of these people, began their career in the UK, in London. I mean, for Decca, working for Decca, with his London Philharmonic and Covent Garden appointments. And from that base, he was able to really create a huge presence on the Decca record label. Of course, the Solti ring is famous, and deservedly so, by the way. There's some wonderful singing and some wonderful conducting in it. So it's not that he wasn't capable. It's that he wasn't capable of everything that they made him do. That was the problem. And he was also another conductor whose remakes were almost invariably more terrible than his first efforts. That was true mostly of his Mahler, of his Bartók, of his, the list goes on. He did not redo things terribly effectively. Even some of his operas got sort of less interesting as he got older, but he just kept making records. on and on. And of course, they won Grammys, especially in Chicago, because in those days, particularly the local branch of NARAS, arranged, which is the National National Academy of Recording Arts and Sciences, which votes for the Grammys and puts them on. You didn't have to listen to the records to vote for them, and the local chapters of NARAS could tell everyone internationally, I mean nationally, it wasn't an international award, who to vote for. And in the classical area, which nobody listened to and nobody cared about, nobody knew, they always said, just vote for Solti in Chicago. And they did. And he became the all-time Grammy champion winner based on recordings that were, as often as not just dreadful. So looking over his career, I mean, he did some wonderful things with Vienna. He did some wonderful things with Chicago. He did. But the attention that he got was out of all proportion to the quality of the recordings taken as a whole, especially if you think about the non-operatic stuff, where, the availability of great singers is what really determined the quality of the recording, not so much the conducting. So Solti is number one on my list. These are in no particular order. Number two, well, you saw this one coming, Simon Rattle. Simon Rattle was a true phenomenon, a brilliant career manager for himself. He took a provincial British orchestra and turned it into an international phenomenon, aided in no small degree by EMI Records and the British military and industrial music complex. You have to remember that at all times in this period, the capital of the classical music recording industry was London. It's where things were based. And it's ironic that this international industry was based in London, because London had the most xenophobic provincial bunch of music critics and press in the entire world of classical music. They were obviously, out to boost anything British in any way that it could be related to being British. That is, the artists, the orchestra, the record label, anything that they could do to push their own brand. And they were also very good at advertising. Some of the great advertising firms in the world are British. They're very, very fine. So it was only a matter of time before you had a young British conductor with a lesser-known British orchestra, and with the entire British establishment behind it, and it became a world phenomenon. Rattle became a world phenomenon. It wasn't because of the quality of the records he made, believe you me, because he is a very, very average talent when it all comes down to it. The other thing that is very interesting about Rattle is that he was popular because he was seen as an outsider, which was very, very interesting, because I know this for a fact, and I know this personally. When the city of Birmingham Symphony used to show up in New York, they would all hang out at a record store that I used to, frequent as well, called Drummer's World, which is fabulous. It was on 46th Street and Broadway and Times Square, and the percussion section would go there, and people would talk, and they had a reputation, that orchestra, for being just incredibly arrogant and full of themselves, because they were the flavor of the month in the English musical press. And the English orchestras, who also hung out at Drummer's World, and I got to know some of those people too, they detested the Birmingham musicians, because to become one of the London players was the goal of a classical music orchestral career. You started out in the provinces and you worked your way up to London. And the way London worked was, they drew from this enormous pool of players. The orchestras had a nebulous existence as regularly constituted ensembles. I mean, they were regularly constituted in that they gave concerts, but the personnel changed freely, depending on, they were just a huge pile of freelance musicians who were running around. And so getting to London and becoming part of that pool of musicians, and playing principally in one of the major London orchestras, was your career goal. And the Birmingham musicians were considered second rate, and some of them were, but it was at a time when the level of music education and performance had risen so high that even the second tier or provincial orchestras on any given day could give a concert that was just as fine as anything one of the major orchestras could do. And so there was that thing going on. And Simon Rattle was really the icon that sort of cemented that happening. And so what you had was enormously talented, or at least consistently good, provincial ensembles that got the backing of the major labels that had hitherto only been promoting the 2 or 3 or 4, or the handful of major London orchestras. So this pissed off all the London musicians to no end. But what we saw was this endless paean of praise for this guy, this orchestra, which anybody who knew the history of the discographies in question and actually listened to the recordings would know was complete bullshit. But that's what they sold. So Simon Rattle is definitely a big one on the list. Next, Charles Dutoit. Charles Dutoit was, to my way of thinking, the last of the conductors whose careers were really the creation of a record label. Because Dutoit was sort of a nobody, before he got Montreal. He wasn't, recording-wise, musicianly, people's concert careers are different things and subject to different forces. But, before that, he had done a couple Decca recordings. He did the Saint-Saëns, piano concertos with Pascal Roger, and he did the Saint-Saëns tone poems, and he did, Petrushka and some recordings with Martha Argerich, who he was married to briefly, the Tchaikovsky First Piano Concerto. There were a few things for Deutsche Grammophon. He was a, what was then Polygram, later Universal artist, but not one of the more important ones, not one of the bigger ones. It wasn't until he got Montreal, and to his credit, he stayed in Montreal and worked the program in Montreal, that he was able to get all of the acclaim, because he was a Decca artist, British company, British press, Canada, Commonwealth country that no one paid much attention to up to that point, other than Glenn Gould and their crop of very, very fine pianists. And so Dutoit was able to parlay all of this into a career. Again, the recordings that he made in Montreal, although they were a very, very fine orchestra, don't get me wrong, were pretty average, especially in French repertoire. And when he went to do really interesting French repertoire, like Roussel and Honegger and all those, he went to Erato. He couldn't get Decca to do it. It was very interesting, actually. He would have been better if he'd been able to make those recordings in Montreal, because he would have had a much finer orchestra than the ones he had to settle for to do those other symphony cycles for Erato. But he was the French music specialist. He was the successor in Decca parlance to Ernest Ansermet, who, with a not great orchestra, made an enormous number of recordings for Decca, because Maurice Rosengarten, who was the head of Decca International, as opposed to just the London branch, was based in Geneva, where the Orchestre de la Suisse Romande was. So they had Ansermet, and they promoted him ceaselessly, but he was the real deal. He was a fabulous conductor of French music, an interesting French music, whereas Dutoit, not so much. Not so much. His recordings, generally speaking, aren't as good interpretively, I think, as Ansermet's were, not as interesting, and he had a much more limited range of repertoire. So there it was, another creation of the record industry. Then we have the period instrument people, which was wholly a creation of the record industry, because it gave the record business an excuse to re-record all the standard Baroque and classical repertoire and make it sound different. It was a purely commercial enterprise. It had nothing to do with scholarship or any of that folderol, because most of the scholarship was just crap anyway. And one of the more interesting cases, we have two here, one of which won't be a surprise, I'm sure, but the one that was just as interesting, maybe even more so, was Andrew Parrott. Andrew Parrott had the Taverner Players or something like that, or the Taverner Consort. He was one of those guys. He put together a bunch of pickup musicians on period instruments. They're all the same people. They all were the Orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment and the English Concert and the Academy of Ancient Music and all these people were the same people. They just changed their name depending on what record label they recorded for. Well, EMI was slow to jump on the period instrument bandwagon. EMI did have early music specialty labels. But the interesting thing about EMI, or HMV as it was in Europe, is that those labels were not British. They were German. And so the German division it was a huge company. The German division had a lot of the early music stuff. And when it came time for the English to start pounding at the door of the period instrument movement with the Academy of Ancient Music on Loiselier and Pinnock, and the English Concert was on Archive, and Gardner was on Erato, and then Phillips, and all of the Universal labels, what became the Universal labels, they had their early music specialty programs, and they were rather more advanced in the UK anyway than HMV's was. So they looked around. Someone scratched their heads, at their little bald heads, like that one, at headquarters in London, and said, "We need one of those." And so they found somewhere Andrew Parrott, and they told him to scrabble together an ensemble, and they started making records with him. Does anyone care about them now? Does anyone even really remember them very well now? No, they don't. They don't. And they did quite a bit of recording for quite a while, for a few decades, a couple decades for HMV. But they were a wholly artificial creation of the English early music military industrial complex. So was, of course, our good friend Roger Norrington. Now, Norrington, of course, was the biggest phony that ever picked up a baton. But beyond that, he really shrewdly parlayed that into a huge international career, entirely on the basis of the recordings he made with, what was it, the English Classical Players, or something, I don't even remember what they were called. Lots and lots of recordings he made for EMI and HMV, and he started pushing that repertoire into the Romantic period. That was his gimmick. And no matter how horrible it sounded, and it did sound horrible, the English press was there to tell us what a revelation it was, and how novel it was, and how fresh and new and wonderful it was. And the worse it sounded, the more interesting they thought it was. And so Norrington had quite the career. Then when he went to Germany and got the Stuttgart radio, he had a ready-made record label, and he was just going like gangbusters, doing music that he had no business being within 100 million miles of. But it was all the creation of the record label's marketing wings, and also by that time, the orchestras themselves, got into the marketing business, because the labels were slowly losing money and getting out of the classical business and turning their backs on all of this stuff that they'd done. And it was becoming a much more fragmented market. And when you have a fragmented market and very little talent, then, people like Roger Norrington can thrive, because they can become an outsized fish in a teeny, teeny, tiny pond, which is essentially what happened there. So there are my 5 least deserving conductors whose careers were essentially media creations, and not so much the result of their innate musical ability, at least as far as I'm concerned. If you have some suggestions for conductors of that stripe, feel free to include it. But be thoughtful. I'm just asking you, be thoughtful, because if I see silly things, if you all run around saying, Carl, or Colin Davis, I'm just going to delete your comments. Because it's not true. There's a factual element here at the base of this. It's not just who you like, or who you disliked. It's about what really happened. So there is some knowledge of the history of the industry, or at least the discography of the major composers that these artists supported, would be useful in compiling your list. So with that said, go forth and list, and keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me.